Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Muhammad Tawfiq Hassan Khan. Today we will discuss about the dissection of anterior abdominal wall. Under the region of the anterior abdominal wall, we will dissect rectus sheath, inguinal region, and anterolateral wall of the abdomen. At first, I will make a longitudinal incision from giphisternal junction to symphysis pubis, top of the symphysis pubis, and making a semicircular incision around the umbilicus. Then, from the first point of my first incision, I will make a transverse incision laterally up to the mid-axillary line. Here is a mid-axillary line. From giphisternal junction, transverse laterally to mid-axillary line. Then, from the lower end of my first incision, I will make an oblique incision. An oblique incision along the inguinal ligament laterally to its middle. Then the skin is to be reflected laterally. So this is the condition after reflecting the skin laterally, and this is the superficial fascia. This superficial fascia is also reflected laterally as that of the skin. So this is the condition after reflecting the skin and superficial fascia. After reflecting the skin and superficial fascia, this is the rectus sheath. Anterior wall of the rectus sheath is now exposed. Here, the external oblique muscle, and this is the anterior wall of rectus sheath is now exposed. Now, this is the midline from the giphisternal process through umbilicus to pubic symphysis. This is the midline. Now, we make another longitudinal incision lateral to the midline, 1 inch lateral. This is the midline, 1 inch lateral to the midline. We will make another incision, a longitudinal incision over the rectus sheath. Now we reflect the anterior wall of rectus sheath both sides and exposed this muscle. This is rectus abdominis. Now, after reflecting the anterior layer of rectus sheath, the rectus abdominis muscle is exposed, and we will reflect it medially with the blunt end of the forceps. And here we can see the posterior wall of rectus sheath. Posterior wall of rectus sheath. As the mode of formation of the rectus sheath is not uniform throughout the rectus muscle, so it can be divided in 3 parts, which are arranged above the costal margin, from the costal margin to midway between the umbilicus and symphysis pubis, and below the level of this imaginary line midway between the umbilicus and symphysis pubis. Now I am using a cotton thread to demarcate the costal margin. Here you see this cotton thread, and this is the costal margin. I am using another cotton thread to demarcate the imaginary line midway between the umbilicus and symphysis pubis. Above the costal margin, the anterior wall is formed only by the aponeurosis of the external oblique, and as the aponeurosis of the internal oblique and transversus abdominis are attached to the costal margin, the posterior wall is deficient here. from the costal margin to an imaginary line midway between the umbilicus and symphysis pubis. Here, the internal oblique muscle splits into two lamella, anterior and posterior. The anterior lamella blends with the aponeurosis of external oblique and form the anterior wall, and posterior lamella blends with the aponeurosis of transversus abdominis and forms the posterior wall. Below the level of this imaginary line, the aponeurosis of internal oblique doesn't split, but together with that of the transversus abdominis and of the external oblique, it forms the anterior wall. So here the anterior wall is thickest and posterior wall is deficient. Here we see the imaginary line midway between the umbilicus and symphysis pubis, and below this imaginary line the anterior wall of the rectus sheath is thickest because the aponeurosis of internal oblique doesn't split here. Here we see the formation of the anterior wall of rectus sheath below this imaginary line. It is formed by aponeurosis of external oblique, aponeurosis of internal oblique, and aponeurosis of transversus abdominis. Together they form this anterior layer below this imaginary line. To expose the inguinal region, I will make my first incision from the anterior superior iliac spine to the midline of the body. This is the midline. So from the anterior superior iliac spine to the midline. Then my second incision, that is from the second point of my first incision to the top of the symphysis pubis. This is a longitudinal incision. Now I reflect the triangular flap downwards and laterally. Now as we reflect the skin on both sides, downwards and laterally, downwards and laterally. Now this is the aponeurosis of external oblique, and as we see, this is the spermatic cord, and here is the superficial inguinal ring, that is an imperfection of external oblique aponeurosis. At first, I will make a longitudinal incision from Giffey-sternal junction to symphysis pubis, top of the symphysis pubis, and making a semicircular incision around the umbilicus. Then from the first point of my first incision, I will make a transverse incision laterally up to the mid-axillary line. Here is a mid-axillary line. From Giffey-sternal junction, transverse laterally to mid-axillary line. And finally, from the anterior superior iliac spine, a transverse incision up to the midline. This is the midline. From anterior superior iliac spine up to the midline. Now, after reflecting the skin and superficial fascia, this is external oblique and its aponeurosis. See the direction of the muscle fiber of external oblique downward from lateral to medial. Now we cut the external oblique muscle laterally, approximately along the mid-axillary line from the costal margin to iliac crest. Then we reflect the external oblique muscle medially and now the internal oblique muscle is exposed. See the direction of the muscle fiber of internal oblique. Direction of the external oblique is like this, downwards and medially, and internal oblique is like this, that is perpendicular of external oblique. Now after reflecting the external oblique muscle, we will make another incision from iliac crest near the costal margin along the mid-axillary line and reflect the internal oblique muscle medially. After reflecting the internal oblique muscle, the transversus abdominis is now exposed, and here you can see the pattern of the fibers of transversus abdominis. After reflecting the transversus abdominis, below the transversus abdominis we will see a glazy membrane. This is attached with transversus abdominis muscle, and this layer is called fascia transversalis, and below this we will find another membranous layer, that is parietal peritoneum.